And now, the nations of the world, brought to you by Yakko Warner.
United States, Canada, Mexico, Panama, Haiti, Jamaica, Peru, Republic Dominican, Cuba, Caribbean, Greenland, El Salvador, too, Puerto Rico, Colombia, Venezuela, Honduras, Guyana, and still Guatemala, Bolivia, then Argentina, and Ecuador, Chile, Brazil, Costa Rica, Belize, Nicaragua, Bermuda, Bahamas, Tobago, San Juan, Paraguay, Uruguay, Suriname, and French Guiana, Barbados, and Guam. Norway and Sweden and Iceland and Finland and Germany now one piece. Switzerland, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Italy, Turkey and Greece. Poland, Romania, Scotland, Albania, Ireland, Russia, Oman. Bulgaria, Saudi Arabia, Hungary, Cyprus, Iraq and Iran. There's Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, both Yemen, Kuwait and Bahrain. The Netherlands, Luxembourg, Belgium and Portugal, France, England, Denmark and Spain. India, Pakistan, Burma, Afghanistan, Thailand, Nepal, and Bhutan, Cambodia, Malaysia, then Bangladesh, Asia, and China, Korea, Japan, Mongolia, Laos, and Tibet, Indonesia, the Philippine Islands, Taiwan, Sri Lanka, New Guinea, Sumatra, New Zealand, and Borneo, and Vietnam, Tunisia, Morocco, Uganda, Angola, Zimbabwe, Djibouti, Botswana, Mozambique, Zambia, Swaziland, Gambia, Guinea, Algeria, Ghana. Burundi, Lesotho, and Malawi, Togo, the Spanish Sahara is gone. Niger, Nigeria, Chad and Liberia, Egypt, Benin and Gabon, Tanzania, Somalia, Kenya and Mali, Sierra Leone and Algeria, Dahomey, Namibia, Senegal, Libya, Cameroon, Congo, Zaire, Ethiopia, Guinea-Bissau, Madagascar, Rwanda, Myanmar, and Cayman, Hong Kong, Abu Dhabi, Qatar, Yugoslavia, Crete, Mauritania, then Transylvania, Monaco, Liechtenstein, Malta, and Palestine, Fiji, Australia, Sudan.
Excited about this video. Out of all this stuff, out of all the things we learned in this class, I think this is actually the one that I'm most qualified to talk about. Shockingly, we are getting into foreign policy, and this is what I got my degree in college, and this is something that is really near and dear to my heart. I mastered in U.S. foreign policy. It is a complicated subject. Even before our current administration, it was always complicated. It has never been a straightforward issue. Our foreign policy is all over the place. That's partly by design. I mean, we're in a lot of different places in the world. Our relationship with the world is complicated. There's a lot of things that we have done really right. There's a lot of things we've done really wrong. And as a country, it's important for us to talk about this stuff and know the impact that our country has in the world. And our politics don't just affect us. When the world watches us, when we vote for president and we vote for our Congress, the world watches, and that is very, very true. The decisions we make affect everybody. We are the big superpower in the world, so whatever we decide and the direction our country goes is a lot of the way that the world goes. And our relationship with the world is complicated in a lot of different areas. We have a lot of complicated issues that have sprouted up over the last couple of years, have been growing for the last couple of years. They are not simple to solve by anybody. So this is why it's so important to talk about this. I really, of all the things that we talked about, I really have loved and enjoyed talking about all the things in this class. But this especially is just near and dear to my heart. So I'm really excited to get going and talking about this. You know it's serious when I pull out my Sac Republic jacket, too. That's when you know that it's a serious topic and that we're ready to get going. We are going to talk about a couple different parts of American foreign policy. First is the foundations of our American foreign policy. What has been established, what our foreign policy has usually been like For being such a new country, we actually gained a lot of power pretty quickly and became a superpower really quickly. That is rare. Usually most countries have been superpowers in the past and controlled a global system, have usually established themselves a couple hundred years before and culturally have figured themselves out. And we're just in a very different world. We live in a world that is much more interconnected than it ever was before. We live in a world of information and quick information, and we lived in a world that can sometimes be scary. And we really do need to talk about this kind of stuff. So the foundations of American foreign policy and what came before what we have today in the modern era. We're going to talk about the world wars and how they impacted all of us. I mean, it's still to this day we are feeling the effects of World War I and World War II. We usually look at World War II more because it changed the entire global system. But we really do need to talk about what those world wars did to us as a country and as a people. Then we're going to talk about the Cold War. That was a whole thing too that I think people really should know about. Sometimes we overlook it. And then we're going to talk a lot about the post-Soviet Union. We're talking a little bit about something called containment. Then we're now going to get into our modern foreign policy and what that really looks like. I can't really talk too much about current issues because I just don't want to, everything's changing so rapidly and we focus on things, especially in foreign policy, that go so quickly and things can change in an instant. So I'm really not going to talk about some modern stuff. I'm just going to give you guys an overall context of where we stand in the world and what the world is going to look like potentially in the next couple of years and how we are going to interact with it. We're going to take mostly a historical look at all these foreign policy decisions and how it affects us now. I'm just giving you guys a basic overview of what this whole thing is all about and how we interact with the world. And hopefully it helps you guys understand where America's place has usually been in the world and where we are now and where we could be in the future. So let's get going. Let's talk about the foundations of American foreign policy. So obviously Washington was our first president. And Washington, through many of his different actions, set the course for establishing international relations for the entire United States. While Congress and the Supreme Court handled a lot of domestic policy, the presidency was the face of the nation to the rest of the world. They are the head of the diplomacy. They are the ones who can receive heads of state, who can receive diplomats. The president is the one who really lays out all of America's foreign policy when they come into office. And Washington really wasn't trusting of anyone outside of the United States. And what he took was called an isolationist standpoint. And you guys read this when you read Washington's farewell. His isolationist stance would last all the way until World War I, basically. We did not get involved in any other wars outside of our own that were not started by us or are on our own borders until World War I, where we did not take any stance. We were an isolationist country. And part of this started with the French Revolution. Washington was given a choice to either intervene in the French Revolution because at that point he had made a deal with King Louis, who got his head chopped off, and Alexander Hamilton showed up and said, why are we going to go help a king who is dead? Why are we going to go help this king who we made this agreement with, but he is literally dead? What are we going to do? We don't have an agreement with this new government or where the French are going to lead themselves. And Jefferson sits there and is on the other side of Hamilton, of course, and says, we need to stand up for our French brothers. We are there in a democratic society. We are supposed to stand for democracies, and they're trying to create their own. Why don't we go and help them? And Washington really sided with Hamilton. And Washington said, we need to stay out of this. We need to make sure that we don't get involved in wars that can really hurt us. We are a new country. We cannot be out there making policy like this. We need to be out there doing other things. We need to be focused on ourselves and what makes us great. And if we don't do that, we're really going to fail before we even start this whole experiment. Washington really understood Jefferson, but he also knew that they needed to stay out of it. They needed to have that isolationist stance, meaning that they needed to isolate themselves from the rest of the world and maybe not completely cut themselves off, especially with trade. Washington's farewell is the most poignant warning of all this. And I had you guys read this earlier, but this is exactly what he says in that. Avoid foreign entanglements. Do not get involved with people who are outside of our country. He proclaimed this idea of neutrality. Staying neutral in all these different areas. Don't take one side or another. Stay neutral in all this. If you stay neutral, we're going to be fine. You're going to build yourself. He also laid out that allies and enemies are going to try to change America's direction. They're going to try to pull them in one way or another. Allies are going to try to pull them into wars, and enemies are going to try to pull them into wars as well. Do not let them do that. And if you stay with each other, you're going to be okay. And he wanted them to take this isolated position in the world. Everyone in the world, quote unquote, was over on the other side in Europe. Be by yourself. You're living there. You have your own country in this new world. Take advantage of that. and focus on yourselves. If you do that, you're going to build this great nation that we can all have. And let Europe fight each other. Let Europe sit over there and fight one another. Let them kill each other. That's what they've always done. And if you avoid what they've always done, you're going to be okay. This whole isolationist idea would take a hold in American foreign policy for years. And I mean, like a lot of things Washington set in motion, he really did set a full policy in motion that people started all the way until World War I, which is almost a good, I don't know, a little more than 100 years. It's pretty good for one policy that people followed with many different presidents and many new things. We didn't get involved in that stuff. So America kind of takes this isolationist stance, but they're also not willing to be pushed over. One of those primary documents that really established American foreign policy was the Monroe Doctrine. And President James Monroe established the stance against Europe expansion in the Americas. He wanted to make sure that even if Europe was continuing to have all these little colonies and all these other things, he did not want encroachment into United States territory. With newly established monarchies and changing governments in Europe, it meant opportunities for expansion in America again. And Europe was kind of gearing up after it fought its own self and was killing itself, basically. They were able to expand and start looking outward again. And where's the first place they're going to go? Probably to America, where there's a lot of opportunity. It was established in 1823. The Monroe Doctrine states that Europe would no longer be able to expand and assert influence in Latin American countries. This was American influence in the territory and needed to be left alone. This was America's turf. The Western Hemisphere was off limits for all of Europe. This was it. You do not have any say in what goes on here. We are on our side of the world. You leave us alone and go away. And this was a warning that America would assert its influence if Europe tried to keep pushing itself into the continent. It implied that military power would be asserted if necessary. They didn't directly say, we're going to kill you if you come over here, but it was kind of hinted that, yeah, if you come over and you try to mess in our turf, we have ships, we can go and try to kill you. The funny thing was, this was a complete bluff on the United States. The War of 1812 had really wiped out most of the U.S. Navy. It wasn't really a strong Navy at that point like what we have now. And it had almost no power or influence to fight over Europe. But somehow, Europe it was a combination of Europe being so preoccupied with those internal struggles and not wanting to expand into America as much as it once did, that really, it kind of put its hands off. It's like, all right, well, we're just not going to go over there. We don't want to have this stupid battle. We're not even going to try to challenge this because it's just not worth it. We have so many other things going on in our continent that we really can't focus on that. They had massive wars, civil wars, revolutions, they had famine, they had all these other issues that over the course of a couple of years, they ended up having to stop and really look internally. So it was kind of a good moment for the Monroe Doctrine to establish itself in American power, and it was a great bluff. It was also Europe kind of just not caring at that point. So it was a good combination of both where it established American power, but was a complete bluff, and it wasn't going to do anything, but the Monroe Doctrine has been important since that point because it laid out, again, do not influence our hemisphere. Do not take that. And this is where crises like the Cuban Missile Crisis started, because the Soviet Union started to encroach into our territory. And what do? We established our right as the controllers or rulers of this entire hemisphere. You don't come into our turf. You stay out and you go away. You go home. So then the Civil War happens, and we've talked a little bit about this, but many countries declare themselves neutral on both sides of the Civil War. They take no stance either way between the Union or the Southerners. But Southern leaders really tried to convince European leaders to support them, but support never came. They thought the reliability on Southern cotton would help in support. Really, nobody thought that the Southerners would win. That's kind of a good bet, but they didn't want to take any sides. It was pretty even. I mean, the Civil War wasn't a guarantee that the North was going to win. There was a very good chance that the South could win. Really, the Europeans didn't want to cut off any ties of potential countries that America could split into, because maybe there was a southern state and maybe there was a northern state. What is that going to look like? I mean, that was a possibility. At least that's something that could have happened. It's interesting to think of how other countries viewed the Civil War outside of this and internally looking, be like, well, this new country is tearing itself apart. We really should just look and just wait and see what happens. And trade was hurt during this time as southern ports were largely blocked. I mean, really, if they had gained at least one European ally, it would have been a lot like the Revolutionary War, where the French came to help us fight against the British. It would have really been a big help, but the help never came. They never got anyone, they never convinced anyone that they could beat the North. And they ended up losing and being isolated on their own, and then that was it. So once the Civil War is over, the isolationist policy of the United States stayed intact, and many presidents cited Washington as an inspiration to avoid foreign entanglements and or investments. And again, this was a time of a great expansion for the Industrial Revolution. We were moving westward. We were adding states like California and other places that we had just established. And really, there was no need to go and entangle ourselves in foreign investments. We might as well just focus on the investment in ourselves and try to expand our country. And that's exactly what happened. But like many things, we can't avoid foreign entanglements very long, and especially in a world that was more and more connected, even at that point, was very connected with many ships and ports. People were traveling more than they ever had before, farther than they had, and the world was expanding, and the world was getting too big, basically, for itself. And World War I ends up happening. And again, I'm not going to get into how World War I started. So as Europe begins fighting amongst itself again, and it starts this massive world war, President Woodrow Wilson kept the United States neutral in fighting for almost 3 years, citing non-interventionist policy, again, taking the usual United States stance. The United States, the public opinion amongst people against Germany, because Germany was the bad guy in 2 world wars, but especially in World War I, they were, well, World War II especially, they were the bad guy. But World War I, they were also the bad guy. And public opinion against Germany became very negative in the United States. So more and more people were like, well, we really don't like the German Empire. What should we do about this? We should really stop them from trying to encroach on European territory. But it was the sinking of American merchant ships by German U-boats that drove U.S. policy to intervene in the war. And this began a war to end all wars. They thought that this was the Mag Daddy of wars. There's so many countries fighting, so many people. This was a huge, huge battle between everybody. And Congress declared war on Germany in early 1917, and then on Austria-Hungary in late 1917. It sided with the Allies, which were the United Kingdom, France, and Russia, and then it was also the United States. And then we ended up winning. It was a very long, deadly, costly war. If you've never read anything about World War I think most people focus on World War II and just how gruesome and appalling that was, obviously. World War I was just as horrible and really probably even ruined Europe even more than people realize. I mean, World War II wasn't a great time for Europe at all, or being a European citizen. And the war ended, and President Wilson set to establish a post-war treaty to end all wars. And it was called the Treaty of Versailles. So these are the two most important things to come from the Treaty of Versailles. One is the establishment of the League of Nations, which would eventually lead to other international organizations that we'll talk about in a little bit. But also that Germany took responsibility for the war. And this one little thing would probably be the major cause of World War II and of the Holocaust. And that agreement is so significant. The primary goal of the League of Nations was to maintain world peace. That was the absolute role of the League of Nations. It's a pretty incredible way that people had come together and tried to figure things out. But this was a really great goal. I mean, the world was becoming so interconnected that nobody had thought, like, well, maybe we could establish a place that we have world peace. Well, there is peace where we don't fight with each other. Maybe we just get along. And it started this idea of Wilsonianism, or Wilsonian ideology. It's a really optimistic view of the world. And it really established that it said men were more than just violent creatures. They could make peace. It was possible for people to have peace amongst each other. They really believed this. It was this idealistic notion. Wilsonian idealism is what it's also called as well. Try to establish 4 different things. One was self-determination, that men could self-determine the direction they wanted to go, that there was a way they could all get along and could agree to one direction that everyone would go to, and that every country had the right to basically self-determine where they wanted to go, as long as it didn't interfere with the peace and love of other nations. Highly idealistic, I know. The second one was the spread of democracy, that really this idea of democracy, these countries were sprouting up, and that maybe we should all band together to promote these ideas of democracy. The next one was capitalism, that everyone wanted to be a part of this capitalist system, that we should spread it worldwide, and everyone should be a part of this free market where the only thing that matters is how much money you make, which in and of itself is, a little optimistic. But it was that idea that everyone has freedom to do this and be a part of this system. Maybe we should include everyone. Capitalism as an idea is very non-discriminatory. It goes off of how much money you make and what your market's like. And the last one was isolationism, which we're going to work together, but we're going to be on ourselves. We are allowed to figure out what we want to do as a country, have our own government, have our own rules, and no government can interfere with that. So after all of this was established. This is the 1920s that we're talking about, and so this is just near the time of the Great Depression, and a lot of things hit all at once. The Great Depression wasn't just a United States thing. It was a worldwide thing. I mean, this is just so... A lot of this is just so incredible. It's just how things come back to bite you, really. This Wilsonian idealism was very short-lived. It did not last long, unfortunately. But it lasted probably about, I would say they gave it a good 10 or 15 years. The League of Nations completely fell apart. It just did not have the power or the structure behind it where people wanted to do this. But this was a great lesson, though, that people learned from the League of Nations, and was established something called the United Nations that we now know. That is really, really important to our foreign policy. And the Treaty of Versailles would set into motion factors in Germany that would lead to the rise of the Nazi Party. The Treaty of Versailles, basically, we talked about inflation last week. Well, Germany experienced probably the worst inflation that has ever been seen in this world. Simple products and food items and clothing and things like that all cost an exorbitant amount because they had so much debt. Basically, they threw all the debt onto Germany and said, all right, well, you guys cleaned it up. You started this war. It's your fault, and that's it. And the German people got blamed for it. And really, rightfully so or not, they were blamed for the war, and they had to pay for everything. It caused a massive depression. On top of that, too, the world was going through a depression. All of this coalesced into one, where Germany was just suffering. I mean, the Great Depression was bad for us. It was probably even worse in Germany. People were dying from starvation. People had no jobs, had no ability to feed themselves. The German economy was a mess. Who are you going to blame? That's what people want to know. Who are you going to blame for our suffering and the way that we feel in our economic suffering? Who can take advantage of something like that? When everyone is feeling down about themselves and down about their country, what happens? Well, the Nazis come right in. And the Nazis say, hey, we should place blame. Where we should place blame is Jewish people. The Jews are the ones who are stealing our money. They have taken everything that we own, and they are to blame for all the problems in our country and the world. And they really hammer in this idea of blaming people and blaming everyone other than themselves or the global economy around them. They have a scapegoat, and that is the Jewish people. One of them. There's not just the Jews, but a lot of other people. But the Jews took the brunt of it. I mean, that's just where most of their anger and their hatred started to be pointed at. And the Nazis focused on the fact that their Germany needed pride again. That Germany needed to feel like they were prideful of who they were as a culture. So what do you hearken at? You hearken on the purity of the German race. Bring up this nationalistic idea that you say, we're going to make Germany what it once was. We're going to make it a country that is prideful and proud of itself. And that slowly then starts to form into this idea of the purity of the German race and the Germany idea and what that means. And slowly but surely, it becomes racism and this racist ideology. The Nazis took full advantage of it. This is what people wanted. They wanted to have a blame, they wanted a scapegoat, and they wanted to feel prideful again about their country and build themselves back up again. The Nazis did that. The Nazis really made sure that they put their nose to the grindstone and fought against the Treaty of Versailles. The leader of that was Adolf Hitler. And Hitler took full advantage of all of this. So if you ever wonder where the Nazis came from, this is why. The Treaty of Versailles is the primary reason. At the same time, in the other part of the world, in the United States, we have FDR. FDR is the new president. The Great Depression has been going on at this point. And he expanded the presidential powers, like I've talked about 3 or 4 other times in this whole class. So we're just mentioning it again. FDR was the biggest expander of presidential powers. He was focused on building the economy for the people and was beginning to see issues rising in Europe. He was dealing with his own stuff with the Great Depression, and then after the Great Depression the New Deal started to kick in, and the United States economy was building and running again, he begins to look outward and sees this thing over in Germany that's happening, and he's like, okay, might want to keep an eye on that and what's going on over there. But Americans had absolutely no appetite for war. There was, again, they kind of, after World War I, it was like, all right, we've had our fill, we got this war done, we don't want to deal with this anymore. We're going to focus on ourselves and go back to an isolationist mode. And they began seeing more and more things happen with Germany and invading and all these other things. And they're like, well, we'll just let Europe deal with it. We don't want to deal with this. Why do we have to become involved? And then on the other side of the Pacific, you have the Japanese who are expanding to multiple parts of Asia. The USSR at this point is the Soviet Union, and they are also kind of pissed because they begin to criticize the Japanese taking over the Pacific and expanding into their backyard. The Chinese did not appreciate this as well. China is not the superpower that we know now. They had their own issues and were going through their own stuff, but they really didn't appreciate this whole encroachment by the Japanese into their territories. And the U.S. begins to threaten to cut off supplies from Japan if it expanded any further. Japan leaves the League of Nations and tries to expand into China. The Japanese, the Nazis, and Italy all form this fascist coalition alliance called the Axis Powers, flying through World War II history, but this is basically what happened. All of them were fascist governments in some way, and the Japanese Empire was especially at this point. Nazis were the ultimate fascists, and then Italy's were kind of the wannabes, has-beens. So the U.S. cuts off Japan after they make this, and once the Japanese are officially cut off from all trading ports and things like that, the attack on Pearl Harbor happens in 1941, and this is in Hawaii. This is probably the biggest attack on U.S. soil since the War of 1812 until Pearl Harbor. This is the biggest attack on U.S. soil. Going into Pearl Harbor and then to 9/11, since that point, these were the biggest attacks on our country. Shortly after, the United States enters into Europe, and they enter into the European conflict, and all of a sudden, there's a Second World War. France, Poland, and Austria have surrendered to Germany. England was threatened at this point, and the USSR was threatened as well. So you have this whole encroachment on both sides of this issue coming. You have England being encroached on, you have the USSR being encroached on, and then they form the Allied powers, which are the US, the UK, and the USSR. The war took many years, killing millions. So there's the fall of the Italian government, the fall of the Nazis, and the fall of the Japanese Empire after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which are the 2 atomic bombs that were dropped on Japan. And finally, World War II has ended. Again, I spent through about a good 7 or 8 years of world history that is absolutely vital, but at least you guys understand it. This is setting up basically for America's role in the world. And Europe and Asia at this point are just in tatters. I mean, this is just... the whole world is just blown to bits by World War II. So this leaves 3 major superpowers who are all trying to figure out how to break up the world. The US, the UK, and the Soviet Union decide, all right, well, now that the war is done, we really need to divide up this world. We've won. What are we going to do with it? So Stalin, FDR, and Churchill, 3 of the most important men in history, form this uneasy alliance. So again, there's Joseph Stalin, who is the leader of the Soviet Union. We have FDR as the United States president. And then Churchill is the leader of the United Kingdom, one of the most famous prime ministers in history for the United Kingdom. Churchill did not like Stalin. Churchill thought that Stalin was shady and a little, I don't really know about this guy. He's going to do something. But FDR didn't trust him much either, but had a better relationship and understanding and thought that Stalin was a means to an end. The things Stalin did would make you really shocked and actually probably would make Hitler look tame. If I'm being quite honest, in terms of how many people he systematically killed, they were his own people, and it wasn't based off of race, but Stalin is not a great dude either. So if you know anything, I'm not going to go into Stalin at all, but it's going to be pretty interesting. If you guys ever want to learn more about Stalin, go ahead and check that out. So they start this Yalta Conference, which this begins, and this is one of the famous photos. This is the video I showed, one of the videos I showed in my intro. The conference begins to take shape between Europe and the 3 powers. So how are they going to shape the world? So it ends in this beginning agreement, but nothing is set. When they leave the Yalta Conference, there's kind of this semi-agreement where they're like, okay, I can see how the world is going to be split up. There's an agreement that apparently Stalin and FDR have. And really the drivers behind this are Stalin and FDR. Churchill is important in this, but not as important. This is like an agreement between Stalin and FDR. And they didn't like each other too much, but they got along enough where they really did make a good agreement. And they felt good about it leaving Yalta. But then something happens, and it really changes the shape of the entire world. That is FDR's death. FDR dies. And so what does the world do at this point? Well, now there's a new president. He had just won a 4th term, which, by the way, that's something interesting as well. He won a 4th term, but really didn't get to finish it. So Harry Truman, his vice president, becomes president at this point. And this begins the meeting at Potsdam. Potsdam is the next conference that they have between the USSR, the US, and the UK. And the Potsdam conference begins while they're still fighting the Japanese. So this is still in the middle of World War II. FDR's agreement with Stalin goes out the window with Truman. Truman's like, I didn't agree to anything that FDR said. I'm a new president. We're doing something different. Stalin gets pissed and doesn't really know what to make of this. And he hears something that is happening in the United States, and that is the making of the atomic bomb. And the atomic bomb really begins this whole Cold War that we have, and we had for almost 60 plus years. And the reason why he hears that they're making atomic weapons that can almost destroy an entire city, they see it with Japan eventually, And Stalin's like, well, all right, well, now that we know we can't really trust you or what you say, we're going to do our own thing. And this is the beginning of the Cold War. So now that we've finished World War II, this is now where we have the Cold War. And the Cold War can really be defined as a ideological battle between the United States and the Soviet Union. And the Cold War begins in the 1950s. This is just after Truman and kind of into the end of Truman's presidency, all the way into Eisenhower and to Kennedy and all these other, the Cold War lasts a long time. It is more of an ideological battle than an actual battle. They set things up. They have proxy battles and proxy wars with other countries such as Vietnam, all these issues in Korea, whereas this communist ideology that the Soviet Union had, which is all about collective group work, and then the United States is all about individuality. So it's based off of these two strong ideas of government and what government is supposed to be and how it interacts with people. And they're on opposite ends of the spectrum, and they were able to look past this when they were allies in the World War. But after that, it's kind of like, all right, well, we fundamentally disagree with this country. We don't think that we should be really there. And they began to look at each other as enemies. And, this sets off this huge ideological battle that would last for decades. And the Cold War is really scary at times. I mean, there's plenty of things that happen that are just really not okay, really get close to kind of destroying our world almost. But the United States takes a very anti-communism stance at this point. Communism is a strong government with control of every aspect of life. They think about every different aspect of agriculture and economies and how people interact and trading and all this other stuff. The central ideology of communism is that everyone is equal and has equality, and that means that no one is better than another person and should have more than another. As a large idea, it's very hard to implement. It's almost near impossible. There's never been a fully communist country in our world. They only have communist ideas and things that lead to somewhat like communism, but we've never had a fully communist country. Gotten close to some of them, hasn't been fully implemented. And there's a couple of reasons why. Again, this isn't a government class, so I'm not going to go into it too much. But this is the stance the United States takes, which is this very anti-communism idea. The United States limited government with limited control. So again, communism is strong government. The United States is limited government. So ideologically speaking, we are just at war with one another. It's democracy versus communism. And this is where we try to take shape of the world, and we start to ideologically fight with other countries. So if we have a communist country that agrees with the USSR, we automatically label them an enemy. If there was a democracy that the USSR didn't like, they didn't really like them as well. They were isolated from the world. And both states have very little actual things to fight about. I mean, that's just the truth. They're on opposite sides of the world. There wasn't really much that they were fighting over except for ideology and for the control of the world. They wanted just to steer the world a certain way. So if it was all communism, that's what the USSR wanted. If it was democracy and the ideas of freedom, that was what the United States pushed. But anti-communism spread so far in the United States. There was something called the Red Scare, which if you ever are able to watch something about the Red Scare, or during that time, the people who were really, I think, Trumbo is a great movie. It's with Bryan Cranston. If you ever want to watch a movie that shows you the scare and the fear that people had with communism, I mean, the guy wrote Roman Holiday, which is one of the most American movies you could probably make ever, besides the fact that it's in Italy. It's crazy that this happened, that people were so scared you couldn't write things about communism in a journal because you were then blacklisted and potentially arrested. This whole propaganda began, and it was called McCarthyism. It was named after this guy who was a U.S. senator from Wisconsin named Joseph McCarthy. Joseph McCarthy and his McCarthyist ideas, it was a witch hunt. I mean, I think that word has been used a lot in our political society now, but this really was a witch hunt. It was looking for people who believed or sympathized with communists, basically took away their freedom. I mean, I don't have any other way to say it, but then they just took away a lot of freedom. And the funny thing is, we live in a society about freedom, and yet here we were hunting down people who might maybe have some connection to communism. And people will be ruined. This guy named Trumbo, who was a screenwriter in Hollywood, was completely blacklisted. People would not hire him because he was considered a communist or a communist sympathizer. And there were many people like that. And it's so scary to think that people were so influenced and so scared by an ideology that, honestly, if you read anything about communism, it's all right. I get the idea, but it's very idealistic. It's probably not feasible. It's kind of a weak form of government, but I understand the scare that people have with it, but it's just so weird that it turned out this way. And it used to scare the American public into thinking the USSR was infiltrating all parts of American life. The funny thing is, Russian government that we currently have right now is more influential than the USSR was on our policies and who we were. Funny enough, that's just through social media. If they had heard how much the Russians interfere with our government now, I'm pretty sure there would have been a war. I mean, there's just absolutely no way it wouldn't have happened. But this leads to many decisions where the United States no longer really took an isolationist policy. We were too entrenched in the world at this point. We had invested too much in the post-World War II world that we really needed to steer in a certain direction. At least that's what we thought. So we kept getting involved in things. And if we didn't like something, we would intervene. And intervention is something that you probably have heard about. We intervene in a lot of different things now. But the U.S. takes a new policy of intervening in situations that may affect American life or what they considered American ideologies. And it used communism as a way to justify these invasions. So some of them were covert, some of them were hard interventions. So there's two different ones. Covert intervention is like you sending spies to certain countries and you killing certain people that might influence policy that would be more communist. That is a very American thing, and that does happen, has happened, and will continue, and probably still happens now, but it definitely happened during the Cold War. The second one is hard intervention, which is like you send soldiers and military, and you get everyone out there to try to stop something like that. And we intervened all over the world. Everywhere. It's been crazy how much we intervened during the Cold War. I'll just go through the continents. So first, there's South America. This used mostly covert interventions. And one of those places was Cuba. We tried to use a covert operation to overthrow the Cuban government. It was called the Bay of Pigs. It was a massive failure on Kennedy's part. One of the most embarrassing things for a president to ever go through ever. And Kennedy was really surprised by this. And part of the reason that happened was the Cuban government is very communist and had very big ties to the USSR. Fidel Castro was not considered a very likable person on the United States part. This eventually led to, this was justification for bringing nuclear weapons into Cuba, or at least the attempt to bring nuclear weapons into Cuba. And this started the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was probably the closest the world has ever gotten to almost destroying itself, where they had heard that the Russians were bringing in ships carrying weapons to Cuba. And it was Kennedy warning them, do not bring them in, or if you do this, we're going to start a war. And basically using the Monroe Doctrine as a whole reason for them starting this war potentially. You're not coming into our territory. And they made a secret agreement that they would pull, I think it was missiles out of Poland. And we just found out recently that was the agreement that they had. They pulled these missiles out of Poland, and they pulled missiles out of Cuba, and the crisis was solved. I mean, just to name just a couple of other places that we've intervened into was Bolivia and Chile, both countries where they had dictators that we didn't really like, so we put other dictators in that we wanted. And this is quite common. Again, I'm laughing because it's just so ridiculous. But this is quite common in the United States. This is something that it definitely comes up in our country's history, where we overthrew these governments and then put somebody else in who we considered more friendly, basically. And then there's Asia, which we've intervened in multiple times as well, using mostly hard interventions. There are two places that I can really talk about the most. Well, the first one we really went into was Korea. Korea was in the 1950s. And there was a communist government in the north, and then there was a democratic government in the south, and they were fighting over which way they wanted to take this country. Korea was one country at one point, and Korea was fighting over it, and what they wanted, ideologically speaking, they were more inclined to join their Chinese and USSR brothers in the north and the communist government there, but then there was this small little pocket of democratic societies in the south, and there was the Korean War, which was also really brutal and completely, people wouldn't say unnecessary. It was kind of necessary. It was also brutal, and it never ended in a full truce. And that is why we now have North Korea and South Korea. That's the divide between the two. That's where it was created. And then there's Vietnam. Vietnam we also intervened in because there was a communist government, and then there was a democratic government. And so what did? We took the side of the democratic government. And we lost handily. This one we actually lost. There was no split between the two countries like in Korea. This was Vietnam. The communist government in Vietnam still exists today, who, funny enough, we happen to really get along with. I mean, it's just weird how the world works. We get along really well with the Vietnamese government. Actually, we get along more with the Vietnamese government, the communist Vietnamese government, than they do with the communist Chinese government. Funny enough, we're more of allies with Vietnam than they are with their own communist government as well. But again, this was us fighting against the USSR. The USSR was, in proxy kind of ways, was funding the communist government in Vietnam, and here we were fighting for the democratic government, and we lost handily again. And then, of course, there's the Middle East, which, it's its own thing. But we intervened in Iran, was a big one, where we tried to help the Shah of Iran. We implemented something there, and then they ended up overthrowing him, and then now they have the Ayatollah, and now we have a country in Iran that really hates us. So you see where all this is kind of ending up, where it's people who ends up really not liking us for a variety of reasons, for meddling and interfering in their country. It's just the way the world works, man. I mean, it's this history. Like, people really don't like when we intervene and stuff. So now we get into the end of the Cold War. This fall of the Soviet Union was huge. This was 1989. The Soviet Union, through the late 1980s, was beginning to fade. And a lot of that was internally just poorly run government things. It was a hard turn to Western ideologies too, and to more of an opening of the system that Russians wanted. People were sick of living under the communist government system and being isolated from the world. And more, since the end of World War II, we had defined our world by this bipolar system. And bipolar means that there's two opposite ends of the spectrum. And the spectrum was the United States on one side and the USSR on the other. And the United States and the USSR balanced each other out through their superpower kind of semi-fighting in the Cold War. They were able to come up with this peaceful way to coexist with one another. And really that changed. It changed once the USSR fell. There was no counterbalance to the bipolar nature of the United States and became this unipolar system. So that's why we now have a unipolar system. We technically still have that right now. There are questions on whether that is changing, but we still are the primary superpower. We control most of the world in terms of it's our system, and a lot of people follow us. Funny enough, since the end of the Cold War, this has really led to one of the most peaceful time in history, which actually is still surviving till now. But this has been one of the most peaceful time in history, especially in the 90s, though. There were arms deals that limited the sale of state arms. There was a huge spread of capitalism throughout the world, so everyone was kind of on this system of capitalism, which, can argue whether that's been a good or a bad thing in some cases, but it's built up a lot of wealth for people and built this huge system where we kind of balanced ourselves and made ourselves reliant on all these other countries and them relying on us. And this led to the U.S. involvement in foreign countries, limiting itself. Bill Clinton rarely, if ever, got involved in a lot of foreign entanglements. They were now focusing on smaller issues and expanding U.S. soft power in different regions. And this is in Africa and India and other places. And soft power isn't like hard power. Hard power is military, where you send your military, you send your soldiers. That's your hard power. That's like you're going to punch them right in the face. Soft power is more of like you're going to talk to them. It's diplomacy. It's like one-on-one. You're going to talk to somebody and have the soft power. And we've had a really good balance in the United States of using both our hard power and our soft power. And that combination has really led us to being liked in most parts of the world. So as the 90s go on and in the early 2000s, something else that we need to talk about that has affected our world and our foreign policy pretty rapidly was the attacks on 9/11. 9/11 changed a lot for people. It wasn't just people in our country, but all over the world this affected people. And it changes this whole perception of us kind of just being like on our own and taking, funnily enough, like a very isolationist stance. We had now kind of all of a sudden taken this isolationist mode that we once had at one point. And the focus now changes from fighting large wars to fighting small insurgents and fighting terrorism. The war on terror is what we used to call it. The funny thing is, like, what is terrorism? It's very easy to find a country and like you're like, okay, that's our enemy and we're going to fight them. But a terrorist organization is very covert. So it's this weird combination of like hard power, but you also need covert power too. Odd combination of these two. And it's much harder to fight a non-government ideological group than it is to fight a government. With small terrorist groups, you can't really fight that as well. So the Afghanistan war begins as a response to 9/11. This was the initial fighting between the United States and Afghanistan. They were to blame for housing Osama bin Laden. This was a justification for going into the Middle East and trying to at least overthrow parts of the Afghan government, especially the Taliban and many other terrorist organizations who were held responsible for the attacks on 9/11. But at the same time, the buildup of the Afghanistan war, there's also this background rumblings of things that are going on in Iraq. And Iraq is just right by Afghanistan. Not that far away from, it's pretty far from Afghanistan. It's in the same neighborhood. And they're talking about, well, Iraq is also a big issue. Iraq is the thing that we really got to focus on. They're building weapons of mass destruction. What that actually means, no one really says, but they just keep saying they're going to build weapons of mass destruction. There's this huge fear of 9/11. And it's used as a justification for intervening in Iraq. There's they keep saying they're planning a terrorist plot, and somebody like Saddam Hussein, who was the leader of Iraq at this point, is going to lead another terrorist attack, even though there was no linking him between terrorist organizations, funny enough. Maybe some, but none that attacked the United States, at least. This huge fear of this happening again, of this 9/11 policy, begins this era where we're now fighting a two-war front. I'm going through this so fast, but it changes the way that we look at the world. It does. Like, we are now fighting two wars in the same place, basically. I think people at this point are like, well, why are we fighting this? They find no weapons of mass destruction. The Afghanistan war is not going great. There's things that are happening there that it took many years, but we're still fighting to this day. So this is currently now the longest war we've ever fought. It's going on 18 years or something like that. And we never officially have left. So it's like, all right, well, why are we fighting these two wars? What's the point? Like, for Vietnam and other places, we never really, like, Vietnam was kind of like, we got the point, but people were kind of sick of it at that point. Korea, people understood. It was just after World War II, we were like, well, we need to go fight them and make sure communism doesn't spread. And I think people more and more are like, why are we fighting these wars? This is so much. But this period is called containment, and it's containing enemies from becoming stronger. So President George W. Bush, again, I don't know why I haven't mentioned his name yet, but George W. Bush is the one who sets up this policy of containment, which means trying to contain certain areas and trying to contain enemies from becoming stronger than they actually are. And he labels in one of his State of the Unions, he labels this axis of evil. And he names Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. And he names them, and this really changes a lot of policy in the United States. It affects the way that we interact with the North Koreans. It affects the way we interact with the Iranians. It affects the way we interact with the Iraqi government, too. It changes our whole policy and our outlook on the world. We now are trying to contain these enemies that maybe are really hard to contain. How do you contain terrorism, which is more about ideology than anything else? It doesn't have a country or land or a capital or anything like that. The Bush policy and the Bush years are so odd. They really, I think people became really disheartened, I guess is the best way to say it, with the Bush years. It's still funny. It still feels so fresh talking about those years and what they meant to people. And I don't think people really look back enough and talk about how much they've really affected. I mean, those two wars cost a lot of money. They cost a lot of time. They cost a lot of lives. For what? What do we get? No one really knows. I mean, almost a worse version of Vietnam in some ways. I mean, Vietnam, ideologically it made sense. It still wasn't great, but at least you got the point. Why? Iraq makes no sense to me. Afghanistan at least made some sense. It was a response to 9/11. Iraq still doesn't make sense to me. So after the Bush era becomes the Obama era. And the Obama era is still so new and still so fresh also that I don't really know how to describe it. I don't know if I haven't read enough newer foreign policy things after the Obama administration since I was out of college, after he had left office, and authors and things like that could talk about this a little bit more. But Obama was more about, not about containment. He kind of continued a lot of policies of Bush. He really couldn't finish much. I mean, he promised to close the prison in Guantanamo Bay, which is its own thing, and I had you guys watch a video about that early in the year. He continues the Iraq war for a while, but then does officially end it, and never was able to complete or finish the Afghanistan war. He negotiates with Iran. That was a big deal. He made the Iran nuclear deal, which was a huge win for international foreign policy, no matter what Trump says. Now it's gone, or at least on the way out. Really, the funny thing is Obama focused more on, he didn't want to start new wars, and that was something people were war weary at that point, didn't want to get in foreign entanglements And Obama kind of went off of that. He could have intervened in a lot of different places, in Egypt, in Libya, and a couple other places where he could have gotten us into wars. In Syria is another one. And he avoided it. He avoided doing that, and he tried to avoid it as much as possible. So the ideas of containment, he continued the ideas of containment and the foreign policy around that, and then kind of let it go by the wayside. And he really focused on those kind of things, and then the expansion of free trade was also a really big deal for him. He tried to come up with a lot of foreign policy things that were based around trade and expanding international trade and really trying to build up certain countries. He also intervened in some stuff, like he was responsible for the assassination of Osama bin Laden, which some people consider a foreign policy. When it's just, I don't know how yet to define the Obama era until really we get out of the current one that we're in, and then we can define him a little bit more. It takes about 10 years for people to look back on certain eras and really have a good perspective on it and see where things led. He tried as best he could, but then now we have a situation where we have a president who wanted to undo almost everything that he's ever done. The Trump era is so odd. I don't even know how to describe it, but let me just describe it like this. The way U.S. foreign policy usually works is through the State Department. So if you guys have ever look or see what the State Department is, they run diplomacy. So we have different embassies all over the place. If we have an embassy, is run by the State Department. And diplomacy is so important because of that. It sets out everything that we do. We use that diplomacy that soft power and diplomacy to put forward our agenda, to talk to people, to try to come up with negotiations, to help people in foreign countries, and our embassies are really important. But President Trump doesn't like when people speak for him. He likes people who speak on his behalf, but don't speak for him, if that makes any sense. I just think he's so odd in terms of that he doesn't trust his own State Department to run his own foreign policy, whatever that foreign policy might be. His biggest thing is he wants to look tough on the international stage. If that's standing up to China, if that's standing up to Iran, if that's standing up to any other country that he feels is acting out, he's going to talk tough, but maybe not do things that are that tough. He's going to kind of go to the line and not get there just yet. That's at least what I've gained from the time of watching President Trump as a foreign policy leader. He's pretty isolationist. I mean, he doesn't want to get involved in foreign entanglements. He actually wants to take a lot of troops who are based in other places. He wants to take them home. He doesn't want people there. He send the troops home is what he said. So that's the type of stuff that he really focuses on. He wants to make sure soldiers especially, are home with their families. And that's a really kind of good thing to take in some cases. I mean, it's good that he's not getting involved in wars yet. But he talks this big game of military power, but doesn't exactly use it. I mean, he talks tough in his words, but isn't exactly tough on his actions. I would say he's also very anti-free trade. If you've ever seen most of foreign policy in the United States, we usually have presidents who promote all different types of free trade agreements, and that's Democrats or Republicans too. Obama tried to negotiate big free trade agreements. Clinton had big ones. Bush, all the way to Reagan and George H.W. Bush, all these modern presidents promoted the ideas of capitalism and free trade and really tried to put up very limited borders between free trading in other countries and us. And Trump is really the first anti-free trade president we've ever had. He's pulled out of NAFTA, which is the agreement between Mexico and Canada and the United States on free trading between their borders and not cutting off limitations for people to bring certain things in, potentially could pull out of other free trade agreements. He's tried to renegotiate other ones for seemingly no reason. I don't really think he understands how trade works, to be quite honest. And he's also very anti-international organizations. Now, other presidents have always kind of had their relationships with the United Nations, which is what was created after World War II. The United Nations has now become one of our primary foreign policy tools that we have used. It was created by the United States, basically. But he rails against large international agreements. So he doesn't like the European Union. He doesn't like NATO. He doesn't like the United Nations. So anytime all these countries all come together, he doesn't really like that. He likes an isolationist stance. He likes when countries focus on themselves and what they want to do. And that's what he constantly tells other countries. He really doesn't think they do anything. And he's partially right. Sometimes they don't get much done. But at least it's important to be talking with people who you don't agree with or people who you do agree with and making sure that you're all on the same page. But I also don't think he really wants to ruin anything and get the blame. A lot of people in the United States on both sides of the aisle support these international organizations. They want to use it differently, but they support being a part of these because it's so important and ingrained in our foreign policy that that's the way it should be run. I just don't know how to describe Trump's foreign policy yet. I really don't. And there's so many things that could happen that might change my whole perception on this, but we really can't make a full judgment on him or what he's done for a couple more years until we really get a look at what has happened and how much he's affected things. I will tell you, as of this recording, things with him, I don't know if he's completely ruined U.S. foreign policy, but he surely has changed it for a very long time. People are going to have a hard time trusting our country. It's just the way it's going to be, and usually this happens with presidents that people in the international community doesn't really like. But it's especially difficult to see countries kind of look at us and just be like, how does this happen? How do we make agreements between each other when we can't trust the United States? The United States has always been pretty trustworthy with its allies, but even our allies don't really trust us right now. And foreign policy is so fickle. So many things can happen all at once that I don't know how else to describe it other than we really have to be mindful of our foreign policy. And a lot of United States citizens are not aware of what our policies are. And we really need to become aware of it and be a part of our world and our international organization. If we don't do that, we're going to really struggle. So that's kind of a history of foreign policy in our world and where we stand now. And this is the best way I can describe it in terms of giving you guys a brief overview of how things have worked and where things stand now. I would tell you to read more about how our international organizations work. But I think that this was really important to just kind of lay out how things are the way that they are right now and why we take certain stances the way we take them. I hope it gives you guys more of a context. I hope you guys can learn a little bit more about this. Do some reading this week on some foreign policy issues that we've been talking about. It's really interesting. I just think that this is a really important subject that people don't bring up that much. Whenever people start talking about foreign policy and presidential debates, people hit the snooze button and don't want to pay attention. But foreign policy is so important. I would just tell you guys to really actively try to be involved in it more, to look up things that might affect you. We're almost done. We got one more week after this, and then that's it. It's crazy. I can't believe we're almost done with all this. So I am very excited to be finished. There's been a lot of recording on my part, a lot of work, and I'm just very happy that we are nearing the finish line, but we are finishing all together. I hope you guys have enjoyed this. I am going to go take a nap. I will hope that you guys get more of an idea of what our foreign policy is like and why it is the way it is. I will see you guys next week, where we will be talking about media and all things media related matters. I look forward to talking about that, and I will see you all next week.